A Giants podcast for Giants fans
by Giants fans.
It's Shaun Morash.
On the sideline, into the end zone. Touchdown, Giants!
From the offseason to the wins and the losses, it's time to take one Giant step.
Welcome into One Giant Step, your full-blown spoiler edition in reaction to Hard Knocks, Episode 3. I am Shaun Morash, my co-host and producer of this fine program is Bryce Gelman, at Shaun Morash, at Bryce Gelman, where you can follow us. We are Episode 3 in the books. This podcast, this next, few minutes or so is going to be all about recapping what we saw and looking ahead to what's teased. And thank goodness from the heavens for Hard Knocks offseason with the New York Giants in this July, as it's really passing the weeks as we are also taping this on a day rookies reported to training camp for the New York Football Giants. Bryce, we are immediately, moments after this episode has ended. It's not even 10 p.m. Eastern. The episode is wrapped. We are in the lab, as they say, ready to recap. How are you doing?
I'm doing extremely well. That episode, Shaun, and I know you teased it as it being the episode with the most fireworks and whatnot, was very enjoyable. I mean, I thought that for the average fan, we've been talking a lot about the casual viewer, someone who's going to watch this. The presentation value is just extremely well done. Like every from the start to finish, whatever you want to say about the football, minutia and whatnot, for the casual viewer, it's presented very well, Shaun.
It's presented well. I almost wish I was not told and hinted at, hey, expect fireworks in Episode 3, because I have to be honest, Bryce, I haven't looked at what social media is saying yet. I feel so disappointed with Episode 3. I really do.
Well, considering how much you hyped it up. But
if I had to rank the episodes so far, Episode 1 I thought was actually the best. Episode 2 was the second best.
Yeah.
And Episode 3, look, television-wise, before we get into what the Giants decided to do, you saw some really cool things, and this is why I think Offseason Hard Knocks is a success in every step of the way, because we start with Episode 1, kind of how a season ended, the look ahead to what a team needed to do in the offseason. Episode 2, I thought was really cool, kind of going inside what happens at the combine, all that, dead time, and the interviews I thought was a really special thing. If you missed last week's episode of One Giant Step, remember, download, subscribe everywhere podcasts are available. I think the coolest part about this episode was kind of seeing in real time, so to speak, the other offers guys were getting and kind of going from there. And we learned a lot in this episode, including, the Jets being in on John Runyon and the connection between Rodgers and Hackett and the Giants having to up that. The Saquon stuff, which I'm going to table and we're going to get to, is a little bit separate. Felt like kind of a letdown after a whole build-up in the season to get to the Saquon stuff. The quarterback stuff, we learned today that Tyrod Taylor was actually the Giants' top choice to bring back a backup quarterback. I thought that stuff was really cool. But ultimately, let's be honest. I mean, what we saw in this episode was everybody the Giants signed and everybody the Giants lost, and kind of guys they probably were in on in between, and just, 5 minutes on each, bing, 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 and the episode's over. So that was cool. It was cool to see, but I wouldn't say this was some kind of like earth-shattering, awesome 37 minutes of TV, Bryce.
No, and I'd have to agree with you in that regard, based on how much you hyped it up. And this isn't your fault. It's just what you heard.
I didn't see the episode. I'm just telling you what people were telling me.
Exactly. So I think among other people who heard you say that it was the fireworks episode, was definitely expecting more. But from what I got, it was enough for me. How much realistically could you expect from stuff that we didn't know already?
Right.
Like, if there was some huge drama out there with Saquon and Joe Schoen, don't you think that Saquon's camp would have leaked that and we would have found that out a couple of months ago? So it's like, how much could we possibly have been expecting based off the information that we actually had? And I thought they did a pretty solid job presenting everything as it was. It's just unfortunate that we didn't get the drama that I think you and I were expecting.
Now, in past episodes, I didn't take notes. I came in fresh. This episode, I felt like, because I picked up pretty quickly into the episode. Okay, we're going to kind of go rapid fire through this, and ended up playing out. So I'm going to show you here. Well, you probably can't see it, but I texted myself a bunch of notes. So I think the best way to approach this episode here, Bryce, this episode of One Giant Step, I'm going to read you off some thoughts, and let's just kind of, piggyback off of each other. Okay. Sound good? All right. So if you're with us in the audience, here's what I got. I'm going to start not in chronological order, because I already kind of mentioned this. Tyrod Taylor, we hear Joe Schoen flat out say it, was the Giants' top choice at backup quarterback. They went through what all these quarterbacks likely would cost. They had a price range for Tyrod Taylor. As we see, based on some of the other signings they end up making, that, $1 million here, $1 million went north of what they thought. Tyrod Taylor kind of came out of their price range on day 2 when the Jets signed him. And Joe Schoen acknowledges to John Mara, not for nothing, his injury history and everything else, which is something we've talked about here on One Giant Step. How good is a backup quarterback really if his one job is to play for the starter? And he too is always hurt. I was really comfortable letting Tyrod Taylor go. He became very frustrating to me as a backup quarterback. But, the Giants went into an offseason kind of planning for him to be the backup. Now, did that surprise you at all?
What surprised me is that everyone refers to him as Tyrod, and we've been on this podcast.
Well, he's called himself Tyrod, and he said he stopped correcting people that his name is Tyrod, so I call him that.
But they're even calling him that on here, and you think the people that actually, own the team, the people who run the team would call him by the correct name, but the two idiots on a podcast are the ones getting his name right.
I do have to say this, because I think Joe Schoen comes across as a really good GM, and I had the pleasure of meeting him last year at training camp. He was on Evan and Tiki. Joe Schoen, and I didn't write this down. There was a moment where he read, maybe it was Illuminor. He didn't know how to say he said his name wrong. Last year when he was honest with Evan and Tiki, he called Bobby Okereke. And now I'm starting to learn with the Tyrod thing. Maybe Joe Schoen just has a little Mad Dog Russo in him, where he's just not great with the correct pronunciations of names. And that's fine. We all have parents like that, right? Where no matter how many times you hear a name or an athlete's name, they always get it wrong. I just think that's in Joe Schoen. If that's the Tyrod thing, I don't know. I'm so over that. And the bottom line is that's the Jets issue.
Yeah, and I just think that the fact that they wanted him back, the fact that they also weren't willing to go that extra length to bring him back when you had Drew Lock as an option on the market, I think was the solid, correct move to make. I think that at the end of the day, how well he played when he came in for Geno Smith, that's enough for me, especially. I'm no GM. The fact that you would save $2 to $3 million when every dollar counts, especially considering what they were going to have to offer Brian Burns, which we saw later in the episode.
Yeah.
They needed to save money where they could. And Drew Lock is a very serviceable backup as compared to Tyrod Taylor.
So before we get to full-blown Drew Lock, I thought there was another line in here that was really, really telling. And we learned more at the end of the episode when they look ahead to next week. Spoiler alert. But when they say Tyrod's their top choice, and he's going over that with Dable, Joe Schoen's going over that with Dable. Dable turns and says, okay, so Daniel, Tyrod, he might have even said Tommy, same quarterback room as last year, and he kind of says it hesitantly.
Yeah.
And Joe Schoen's response is, well, for now, which again is another indication when this takes place in March that the draft, they very much, after the combine, we're looking at quarterbacks. So much so, if you don't like looking at the look-aheads, I'm sorry, this is going to be everywhere on Twitter. They openly tease next week ahead of the draft and pro days that Brian Dable's asked, would you trade up for Jaden Daniels? He said, absolutely. And there's more trade up stuff. So it feels like Hard Knocks is not going to shy away from the fact that the Giants were actively in pursuit of a quarterback in the draft. And maybe that is also why they didn't up the offer for Tyrod Taylor, because deep down they thought, man, if there's a chance to get a quarterback, you can't be paying 3 guys that kind of money. So I thought that was kind of cool. I think that now, look, if you're still on the hill that the Giants weren't looking to get their next guy after Daniel Jones, it seems that you're way wrong at this point with all the inside access we had. And I'm sure next week's episode that we will tape on One Giant Step will probably be a lot of that. But I thought that was interesting. But to the point about Drew Lock, like you said, look, the fall off between Tyrod Taylor and Drew Lock, both of their strengths, obviously, is uncorking a deep ball, as we saw with Drew Lock's time in Seattle when he stepped up. He's clearly not an upgrade over Daniel Jones in terms of an all-around player. And the Giants acknowledged that in this episode. Joe Schoen and John Mara go back and forth with each other on Lock and says, well, he'll have the opportunity. And this was really interesting because I take you back, Giants fans, and Bryce, you'll remember this. When Drew Lock first got here, there were reports, hey, Drew Lock was sold on the idea that he could be the starter in New York. And now you actually hear the words come out of the general manager and owner where this is totally misconstrued. What they said was you can get a lot of the first-team reps while Daniel rehabs from the ACL, and you hear the owner and GM going, but, obviously when Daniel's healthy, he'll have that job. And then they sold the idea of, look what we did with Mitchell Trubisky in Buffalo. Look what we just did with Tyrod Taylor. We've gotten these guys to raises. So there is a sell to Drew Lock. I'm comfortable with Drew Lock backing up Daniel Jones in comparison to Tyrod Taylor in terms of injury and price. But overall, let's debunk the myth that Drew Lock here is going to be the starting quarterback for the New York Giants.
I don't think for anyone that was really a question of whether or not the Giants, after paying a guy $40+ million a year, whether it be him or the guy who's making $5 million per year.
Right.
So, but the fact that it was reported, it was just a misunderstanding as per this episode. The fact that, again, as you said, first team reps, he's going to get all of until Daniel Jones comes back and is healthy. So I guess if there's a win, that is the win. And also the fact of the matter is that Daniel Jones, how many times the neck injuries? 2 and 3 years? The ACL.
Right.
Like, there's a good likelihood that Drew Lock will start at least one game in this upcoming year. The over-under might be at 3 or 4, Shaun.
I mean, it's hard to argue that based on his injury history, Daniel Jones, that is. And then obviously you have Tommy DeVito kind of hanging over this whole thing, and let's see what he emerges as. But ultimately, yeah, I mean, I'm fine. It's not sexy. Drew Lock's not sexy. This is clearly a quarterback room that feels very temporary at best for another year, which is usually not the recipe for a winning team, but we'll see. As I'm going to sneeze here. Hold on. I muted myself because I'm very good at that. Very good job. This is what we call live podcasting after. So, all right. I mean, that was the quarterback stuff. And this is what I'm talking about. Nothing was really sexy, just kind of interesting stuff. I didn't know Tyrod Taylor was the Giants' first choice. You saw that. Now, before I get to what they didn't do, or what they did do with Burns, what they did do on the O-line, and kind of how all that stuff went, let's talk about the Saquon stuff for a little bit. Because going into this episode, the idea that this was going to be the episode of fireworks, it was all about the closure of Saquon Barkley, Bryce, and his time ending with the Giants. And there's a couple of interesting anecdotes here. Number one, the acknowledgement from John Mara that if he goes to Philly, he's going to be, tough to sleep. John Mara basically telling Joe Schoen, he's by far our most beloved player. When he says by far, I understand what he's doing there. He loves Saquon. He loves Saquon, the player. I know he's not thinking this and not intentional. Slightly disrespectful to a guy like Dexter Lawrence. Everybody loves a sexy texting dance and whatnot. But ultimately, I will say this. If I'm going to criticize John Mara as I have on this podcast, and I don't want to because I think he's a good man and he means well as an owner and he cares about the New York Giants like the rest of us. I think Bryce, just from this standpoint, he let ultimately Joe Schoen do what he's got to do. Now, there was an alarming sentence there from Joe Schoen when he was first talking to Saquon Barkley's agent when he basically says to him, this one I'm going to have to run up above me.
Yeah.
And I'm paraphrasing. That still scared me because it gave me that point of, he still had to make sure that was okay with the boss to let Saquon Barkley walk. And the boss did bless it, but that shouldn't be, man. You're the general manager of the team. This guy doesn't fit what you're doing. I still don't like that I'm hearing that.
Shaun, it's more of a business thing. From what I took away from it, it's the fact that John Mara is the president and the CEO of the Giants. He handles the business of the Giants. I'm sure he's got a bunch of other people under him actually running the business side of the operations side of the Giants. But ultimately, this is his family. This is his family's business. And what sells more than Saquon Barkley on the Giants? Yeah. Is there really anyone else? I know you said Dexter Lawrence, but until Saquon left to go to the Eagles, it was Saquon Barkley with the Giants. Yeah.
And you watch how quickly Malik Neighbors, by the way, becomes that player that John Mara.
Exactly. So you lose one of those guys, you replace him with another. John Mara is going to be able to sleep at night knowing that jerseys will be sold. But I understand in the moment when he looks at it, and again, it just felt like it was a business decision. That's why he didn't want to lose Saquon Barkley. That's why he didn't want to let go of the idea of bringing Saquon Barkley back and continuing to give him 200 carries a year and continuing. There was all of that involved in a decision that needed to be made, but it was made by the one who wasn't necessarily enamored with the idea of a better business plan. It was what can we do to win football games? That's Joe Schoen's job, and I think that's where John Mara decides to take a step back and let the guy he hired to make the football decisions make the football decision.
Now, we're going to do a little more here on the Saquon stuff. I will say this, a big prevailing point that Saquon himself declared on Twitter right when the free agency thing happened, and Obviously, he was very sensitive to Tiki's tongue-in-cheek remarks about "you're dead to me," and fans kind of went after Saquon. How could you do this? Blah, blah, blah. And the one declarative statement that is stuck with and people have tweeted out and screen grabbed from Saquon was, "The Giants never made me an offer. How could you be mad at me?" And in the trailers leading up to this episode, it's kind of semi-taken out of context, the idea and we see the scene where Joe Schoen's kind of writing down the numbers that the Barry, the agent, is giving him. I am not going to sit here on this podcast and call Saquon Barkley a liar after what we watched, but you talk about a real stretching of the truth, let's call it. Because let's be real here. His agent, that's the word I'm looking for. His agent gives the numbers to Joe Schoen, and Joe Schoen writes those down on the board, whatever it ends up being, the $25 million guarantee, And you hear Joe Schoen relay the message back to Mara, I keep calling him, it's not the Eagles owner, it's the agent, Barry, whatever.
Barry.
Again, guys, we're doing this right off the cuff after the episode.
I think it's Barry.
Barry. He won't even guarantee Shane that will get it done, but he just gives him the ballpark numbers. So that's the numbers he goes with. Then when he finally gets the call back, the Eagles go well north of those numbers that have already been given to Joe Schoen. We're talking about the 30s. I forgot what the exact numbers were. But you end up realizing, while watching this from a Giant fan point of view, is how ludicrous the Eagles were still at peg say, knowing everything we know about Saquon, whether you like him or not. This doesn't even have to do with picking him second overall or not. Just think about the idea of building an NFL roster and Saquon Barkley, all the boatloads of games he missed, and only 3 1,000-yard runs. I mean, it is asinine that the Eagles gave him that money. And
to be fair, but
hold on, I'll let you finish this. I'm just going to say this. I don't begrudge Saquon Barkley from going to Philly. I don't. He should, as a running back, short-lived. These guys don't get paid. Go take that money from the Eagles. He owes nobody here an apology. He owes. I don't wish him the best because he's an Eagle, but I wish him the best in terms of, hey, go take that money, go take care of your family, everything. But to sit there on Twitter and say, hey, the Giants never made me an offer, man, okay, they didn't, because your agent came to the Giants with parameters of a number, and then you got a number way north of that. And Joe Schoen tried to play nice the entire offseason, as now we've seen, where he kept saying in quotes, I didn't want to disrespect Saquon because Saquon felt disrespected by offers in the past. So don't spin it around like the Giants did. They didn't offer you a deal out of respect for you because you were angry at whatever the last deal was, which was close enough to that $25 million your agent called for. So I don't know. In the end, I don't think Saquon looks good because he really tried to put the Giants like they were the bad guys here. Clearly the Giants weren't. But you shouldn't have to apologize either. Go take that money, man. I think it's crazy that Philly did it, but that's not your problem. You should go take that money.
There was a correct PR move to make, and he didn't make the correct PR move by going out, bashing the Giants, bashing Joe Schoen, and essentially making himself out to be this sore loser, when in fact he was the one making the significant amount of money, more than what the Giants were willing to offer him. And I want to make a comment on what you said about the Eagles making the asinine decision. I have to agree with you in the sense that they paid the guy a lot of money, and a lot more than anything I think anyone expected. And I think that will turn out to be a terrible deal, but it is a move that you make when you're all in. It never made sense for the Giants to spend almost half of their cap space or whatever it was on McKinney and Saquon coming back. There were other holes to fill in. When you look at the year before, 6 wins, how much those guys realistically impact winning? It's not a move that you make when you win 6 games. It is a move that you make when you're competing for Super Bowls. You dedicate the rest of the money that you have. If you look at, all right, well, we're stacked here. We want a generational running back, a high risk, but also extremely high reward running back that could push us over the edge when it comes to beating a team like San Francisco, who has Christian McCaffrey, who they pay a boatload of money to each year. So they wanted to take that model and replicate it. And you see it in other sports too, Shaun. You see it with the Knicks trading 5 first-round picks for Mikal Bridges. That's not a move that a team that isn't good enough to make the playoffs makes. It's a move that a team that thinks the move that they're going to make is going to put them over the edge. That's what they do. And that's the one thing. That's why I'll give Howie Roseman a pass. He's probably the best GM in the entire sport. So he obviously did it for a reason. I think that was the reason. We're in lockstep here in this assumption that it's not going to turn out well. We've watched all of Saquon since he got drafted,
And not
in New
turning
York.
out well, Bryce, for anybody that listens, and there might be Eagle fans listening to the specific episode because they want to get the Giant point of view. Not turning out well doesn't mean he won't have a moment or two as an Eagle where he has some kind of crazy day, a couple touchdowns. Of course, it's not like Saquon Barkley is going to completely fall off a cliff this year, but ultimately paying a guy that much guaranteed money, even if you've backloaded 3 years, it's not going to turn out well. It's not.
Six years after he was drafted. It's not like it's
Right,
like
it's not.
4 years since he was drafted.
And
it didn't make
And
sense.
I'm very proud that Joe Shane's closing words on that phone call were we're out. We're out.
Yeah.
Like he didn't even try to negotiate it down. It was just I'm not
Damn
even
right.
dealing with this.
Damn
Which is
right.
great. So he sits down, Joe Shane does with Brian Dable. Hey, pick any position here. What do you think our main thing is? I didn't love the hesitation from Brian Dable, but maybe it also takes a peek into how many holes he has before he finally says, yeah, offensive line. And the Giants had 3 guys circled, and they kept saying their top guy. Their top guy was Illuminor, which I'm guessing meant the scouting room and the Giants coaching staff under him. Their top guy. Also at this time, remember, it's worth noting, Carmen Brasillo was the Giants' new offensive line coach who was with the Raiders, who coached Illuminor. So when they say their top guy, I'm sure that had something to do with it. They were a little surprised that his price was a little lower. They ended up having to go, a little lower in the range. They end up going higher anyway because Arizona has a price. But the Giants end up getting 2 of the main 3 guys they circled, which were Robert Hunt, John Runyon Jr., and Jermaine Illuminor, which I thought was interesting, and really interesting that because of Aaron Rodgers and Nate Hackett in that connection, the Giants had to go same guaranteed money for Runyon, but 1 more year and slightly more overall money, which was fascinating. But the Giants, you hear it right there in the room there, it's an acknowledgement. We need to walk out of here with ready-made starters. So even if John Runyon isn't sexy and Jermaine Illuminor is not sexy, that is clearly a room that went to Joe Shane and said, these are guys we need on this team to beef up. Thought that was interesting. Before I let you piggyback, one more thing of note when talking about Illuminor and Runyon and the free agency pursuit. Was it Brissetti said it right then and there. Hey, look at when we go the extra $1 million for Illuminor. He's either our right tackle or our left guard and starts. And I thought that was interesting, very under the radar. The first time we've really had true acknowledgement. Maybe Evan Neal isn't the right tackle on this team. He's going to be given every chance to try to be that right tackle, but they clearly went the extra $1 million with Illuminor, knowing, hey, there's a chance here that Illuminor is our right tackle and Neal has failed.
Well, we discussed at length, it may not have been you, it may have just been me around that time. Robert Hunt was by far the number 1 option in the entire market for any offensive lineman. He ended up commanding $100 million, $100 million contract from the Carolina Panthers, who paid him how much he deserved to be paid. But I do think that's slight overpay. But the Giants ended up getting 2 out of 3 of the guys they really wanted. And I know that whatever, it might have been Rossini they put up on the screen that they kept showing clips of on NFL Network. I forgot who it was. But essentially saying like the Giants are finally going to address the offensive line. And we've been speaking about it the past few months. It's like they finally did, Shaun. They did. And we wanted Hunt. We wanted Hunt. What do you mean? I mean, they addressed it. They addressed the problem that has been their biggest issue.
My point is they addressed it. It was their big issue. But I'm tired of hearing the Giants haven't addressed it. Nobody has poured more resources between picks and free agency into the offensive line over the last 5 years than the Giants. So
they just didn't do it the right way.
Right, that's my point. We got to stop saying the Giants haven't addressed it. The Giants address it every freaking offseason.
Well, I think they're talking about more or less like this organization, this leadership, and they didn't have cap room. They finally had cap room. What do they decide to do with that cap room? Build in the trenches. They get their guys on the defensive and offensive line, and they let everything else. Everything else will solve itself. They made the right moves.
All right. Lastly, we have to obviously end with the Giants' biggest splash in the entire offseason, which was Brian Burns. And before we get to like what that was like, it was really cool watching the waiting game, and they kind of give you the stress of it. Other targets go off the board. The Giants in the first episodes hinted that they would have been in on Christian Wilkins, who ended up leaving the Dolphins, I think, to go to the Raiders in the meantime. But one part of this that I think is really cool and was evident in episode 2, how much say Shane Bowen has in terms of what they need defensively, because Joe Shane flat tells him, hey, if we go get Burns, the price it's going to cost us nearly $30 million a year, plus the draft picks, that's probably the only tool you're going to get. Now, it's also worth noting, while the secondary is one giant question mark, for lack of a better term here, on one giant step, Tay Banks first rounder, they took Newman in the second round, as we'll later find out. Other pieces, a lot of unknown at corner. But ultimately, they have Okereke, they have McFadden, and now they have also Dexter Lawrence, Kayvon Thibodeau, and Brian Burns. I just think the idea that Shane Bowen keeps signing off on this, I'm going to remember these moments in these episodes if the secondary is getting absolutely torched this fall, Bryce. And I will not be forgiving to Shane Bowen if everybody's like, well, what was Shane Bowen supposed to work with? Look what the Giants have in the secondary. I'm seeing him very clearly sign off that he does not need more bodies in the secondary. So let's go, let it ride. Do think it's awesome that they got the Burns deal done. Really, you could tell how enthusiastic the whole office was doing the Spider-Man thing. And ultimately, I look, the Giant great teams I've watched and the Giant great teams my father before me watched in his generation, pass rush, pass rush, pass rush. And the Giants have felt a pass rusher short for quite some time now, even with Kayvon Thibodeau. I'm fascinated by it. We'll get more into this as training camp goes along, but I think people forget also, like Azeez Ojulari now, his injury-prone history not being counted on, and he could be like a third pass rusher. I think the Giants are going to get after it at the quarterback position. And ultimately, McKinney and Barkley, like at their core, if you're a fan, seeing them walk stinks. But I think another refresher in tonight that Burns, that was the right move for the Giants, and really cool how much of a say Shane Bowen had it.
Yeah, and I know you're setting the scene for the eventual torching, the inevitable torching in at least one or two games. The Giants, the young Giants secondary. One thing they mentioned in this episode, and if you know football, you understand this, is if the defensive line is able to get to the quarterback, it helps the secondary because, of course, because the quarterback, he's not going to be able to throw the ball, and then he's not. So they, I think, deep down, looked at the available talent on the market. They saw what Xavier McKinney commanded from the Green Bay Packers. And they saw it as like, all right, we could get a ready-made defensive lineman who could come in, wreak havoc on the opposing quarterback. We could get that 100% no and actually pay them along what everyone else in the league makes. You pay Xavier McKinney that type of money, you don't think that you could find a serviceable option in the draft? And they drafted Newman. They went out and addressed their secondary need with their second and third picks, with then Phillips in the third round. So they did everything they possibly needed to do. The criticism for Shane Bowen could be fair at the time because it is what it is. They're going to get lit up in games, especially against the Eagles. Like it's inevitable. But they did the smart thing, which was address what you can address and don't push it. Like you don't need to. You don't need to go up to $17 million a year and pay Xavier McKinney. You could find a guy in the second round. Where did you find Xavier McKinney?
You're right, second round. And Newman has the leadership. So that's going to be interesting. But I'm just telling you, I'm planting my flag now. Shane Bowen has not absolved the criticism. Other coaches in the past, right? What do we always say? Well, he didn't buy the groceries. Shane Bowen was in on every move and getting, he had to give his blessing on Burns and, I could work with that second. So very interesting nonetheless. Now, the tease ahead as we gave looks at the draft and the Giants we ultimately know end up with Malik Neighbors and what the Giants are going to do at quarterback. I think this looks really interesting. Obviously, I think quarterback is going to be a big topic on next week's show, One Giant Step. This is exactly why you guys should subscribe and download. Perfect example right now. Obviously, I'm going to continue to talk about this episode throughout the week. I'll be with Tiki the rest of the week on Evan and Tiki. Evan is going to be off the rest of the week. So WFAN free on the Odyssey app, 2 to 620. Us as a show, if your listeners on WFAN are going to be at the Subway Series next Tuesday night, Yankees-Mets. We are doing a show from, I don't even know if I'm allowed to announce this yet, but it looks like Hard Rock Cafe, where we've been before, outside Yankee Stadium.
This is why you subscribe to One Giant Step. You get this news before everyone.
Come by. I realize that maybe we're announced that Friday. I don't know. But whatever. The bottom line is this. We're going to be there. We're going to go to the game. So by virtue of going to the game, I'm, of course, not going to be home as I am right now watching this episode live. So, look, work conflict. What do you want me to do? It's Yankees-Mets. It's also a big deal. And I'd also say maybe because of Yankees-Mets being the game, less people are going to be watching Hard Knocks live. So some of you may be waiting next week till, maybe some of you are waiting till Thursday because Wednesday is also a Yankee-Met game. I won't be at that one. But the bottom line is this. My long-winded saying, download, subscribe. One Giant Step will be out next week, hopefully sometime Wednesday, but you'll get the alert when it is if you've downloaded and subscribed, but it won't be there, this normal right after immediacy of Hard Knocks. So I'm just kind of giving you guys an update on that. But it's a big week in New York next week. You get the quarterback trade-up episode, Malik Neighbors episode of Hard Knocks, and Yankees-Mets. At Bryce Gelman, where you can follow him on Twitter. At Shaun Morash, where you can follow me on Twitter and X. Of course, all our content free on the Odyssey app, everywhere podcasts are available. Brycey, baby, that's it. Another One Giant Step episode Hard Knocks recap. 3 down already, and the rookies have reported the training camp. In the meantime, we are going to be full-fledged football mode soon, baby. What do you think?
Love it, baby. Let's do it.
All right. Thank you,
Keep it coming.
everybody.
Keep it coming.
Thank you, everybody, for taking one giant step with us.